Columbus sailing to the Americas was the most consequential event in human history, and it's not even close. Estimates range by quite a bit, but there were conservatively 60 million and as many as 100 million people living in North, Central, and South America pre-Columbus. In only decades, 90% of them were wiped out by disease. It all happened in slow motion compared to other natural disasters and plagues, but it's by far the worst such event in history. At least 10% of the world's population died in 100 years. So many people died that it dramatically changed the carbon cycle on our planet. Contrary to the myth that Native Americans were hunter-gatherers, they were masterful agriculturalists. Their techniques varied widely, but one common method involved regularly burning forested areas to make way for crops. By 1600, as many as 56 million Native Americans had died, and forests reclaimed the land they had meticulously managed. Some research suggests this lowered atmospheric carbon levels by as much as 10 parts per million. Columbus is one of history's most revered and simultaneously reviled figures. His accomplishment, though it was entirely dumb luck, and leadership in showing Europe there were entire continents they didn't know about doesn't need to be explained. What I've come to think about Columbus, the person, is that he was both worse and not as bad as I thought, and both more savvy and more clueless than I thought. I knew the vast majority of deaths that occurred as a result of his sailing to the Americas were a result of disease and not really anyone's fault. I did not know just how shockingly cruel he was to the natives, especially the Taínos. I had always figured that if it hadn't been Columbus, it would have been somebody else, and they would have been just as barbaric. But the monarchs, Isabella and Ferdinand, were disgusted with his actions. There were strict orders not to treat the natives in the way Columbus did, as they felt it was unchristian, though they appeared to have no problem with enslaving them. While he was a much more skilled navigator than I had ever given him credit for, he had a few hilarious blunders that you'll have to wait to hear about. Although he was a masterful navigator at times, he was less than an incompetent leader. The two most persistent myths about Columbus are that he proved the Earth is not flat and that he discovered new lands. You will see how both of these claims are not just wrong, but wrong on multiple different levels. The source of the myth about Columbus proving the Earth was round is Washington Irving and his book, A History of the Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus, published in 1828. Though the book is now considered a fictional biography, Irving claimed the book was historically correct. He says, "In the execution of this work, I have avoided indulging in mere speculations or general reflections." And yet, Irving perpetuated the myth that Europeans believed the Earth was flat until Columbus sailed west. Critics have argued that Irving wrote his book to push an American nationalist agenda. Nationalism was a common theme in the 19th century, where concepts such as manifest destiny originated. In Irving's mind, he probably didn't think he was lying, or even stretching the truth. He likely either convinced himself his arguments were valid, or read into the historical data what he wanted it to mean in concordance with his biases. In an attempt to make Columbus's voyage more heroic, Irving wrote that Columbus risked being penalized for heterodoxy for sailing west and proving the traditionally held belief that the Bible endorsed a flat earth. In reality, no well-educated person in Europe at the time thought the earth was flat, and there's no data to say about what uneducated people thought. Apparently, there was a 3rd century Christian who believed the earth was flat. His name was Lactantius, and he wrote of the absurdity of thinking that there are those who, quote, walk with their heels upward and their heads hanging down, unquote. Irving also insinuates that St. Augustine endorsed a flat earth, but there's no data to support that claim either. The most glaring problem with this claim is that even if the earth were flat, sailing west or circumnavigating the globe wouldn't be impossible. This would only make sense if north was a point directly on the edge of a flat Earth, rather than somewhere in the middle of it. If the magnetic or geographic North Pole is in the center of Earth, sailing west only makes you go in a circle. But if the North Pole is on the edge of Earth, sailing west would drive you toward its edge. Although virtually nobody, including Columbus, thought the Earth was flat in 1492, Columbus had some thoughts about the globe that were far from correct. Eratosthenes famously calculated the circumference of Earth in the 2nd century BCE to an error of less than 1%. However, Columbus preferred the measurements made by the Persian cartographer Abu al-Abbas Ahmed ibn Muhammad ibn Kathir al-Farghani. Al-Farghani's calculation of the nautical mile was about 5.5% smaller than it really is. Columbus compounded this small error with an even larger one. Although different people use measurements by the same name, in the past each region had its own value for that measurement. Columbus assumed Al-Farghani was measuring in Roman miles when he was actually using Persian miles. The Persian mile is nearly 50% larger than the Roman mile. Together, these errors led Columbus to believe the Earth was 25% smaller than it truly is. It gets more complicated. A straight westerly line from Portugal to Japan is roughly 11,500 miles. If we assume Earth is as small as Columbus thought, that distance shrinks to about 8,800 miles. That was still much too far of a journey across an uncharted ocean that was assumed to be empty. However, Columbus didn't think that it was that far. Columbus worked off of the maps made by Italian cartographer Paolo de Pozzo Toscanelli, who believed in Marco Polo's exaggerated claims about the size of Asia. According to Toscanelli's maps, Japan was slightly farther west of where Mexico is. According to Columbus's model of the globe, Japan would be a mere 4,200 miles from Portugal. While Columbus was a skillful navigator, he seemed to rely more on his intuition than technical skills. He writes in his journal about calculating his position after landing using a quadrant and getting a reading of about 40 degrees north. In reality, he was at about 21 degrees. He blamed the instrument and not himself. Some additional blunders ended in dumb luck. Japan did not trade goods along the Silk Route. Marco Polo never reached Japan but told stories of it from others who had also been told stories. Based on these tertiary claims, Toscanelli indicated on his map that Japan stretched from above the Tropic of Cancer nearly to the equator. This isn't even remotely close. Japan lies entirely above 30 degrees north. Columbus was aiming for land in completely the wrong direction. Columbus first petitioned Queen Isabella in 1486. Her advisors informed her that Columbus was hopelessly wrong about the size of the Earth. Still, she gave him an allowance in an attempt to keep Columbus from taking his ideas elsewhere. Then, in January 1492, Isabella agreed to sanction and fund his proposed expedition. She wasn't convinced the payoff would be great, but the difference between the best and worst case scenarios was vast, with the worst case scenario having almost no effect on Spain or the royal family, and the best case scenario bringing them incredible riches. Through the dumbest of all luck, Columbus landed in the Bahamas, a mere 3,800 miles from Portugal. In other words, he got the right answer using the wrong formula. Not even in Isabella's wildest dreams could she have imagined the riches they would reap in the New World, which had been occupied for at least 14,000 years. Although Columbus didn't think the Earth was flat or prove that it wasn't, he did make a supposed discovery about the shape of the Earth, if only in his mind. Due to either a failure with the technology or his ability to properly read it, Columbus came to the conclusion that Earth was shaped like a pear or a spherical breast with a nipple. His instruments were telling him the sea below him was angling upward toward the sky, and he chose to believe he had discovered the entrance to paradise. This bulge represented the part of the Earth that thrust upward toward heaven, thus the entrance to paradise. Something else about Columbus that isn't true is his name. If you would have met him and called him Christopher Columbus, he wouldn't know who you were talking to. His birth name was Cristoforo Colombo. Sometime before he set sail on his maiden voyage, he changed his name to Cristobal de Colon. Christopher Columbus is an anglicization of Christophorus Columbus, the Latin translation of his given name. Now for the myth that Columbus discovered the New World. Considering the magnitude of his error before setting sail, Christopher Columbus was incredibly lucky. There was no reason to assert any land existed between Spain and Asia to the west. The only Europeans who knew otherwise were the Vikings, but their culture was extinct at this point, and nobody else seemed to know or believe the Viking sagas. He could just as easily have died along with his crew in the vast emptiness of the ocean, because nobody in Europe knew better. Then again, it could have all gone much better for him. Columbus demanded, and was promised, a 10% share of the wealth he found. This would have been enormous wealth, but he never saw the full amount. His competency as governor of the lands he sailed to was so terrible, and his cruelty to the indigenous people was so revolting that the Spanish crown removed him from power. He was even arrested at some point, and he was never paid all of his dues. As an example of his cruelty, the forced labor he inflicted on the Taínos and Caribs was so appalling that they deliberately destroyed their own food stores and fields. It was a deliberate suicide designed to guarantee that no future members of their group would be subjugated to the brutal conditions. As many as 50,000 of them perished. Above all else, the central problem with the claim that Columbus discovered the New World is that he didn't discover anything. Columbus landed on inhabited lands that had been occupied for thousands of years. But even if we modify the claim to say he was the first European to do these things, that is still false. America is not a place, but many places. Typically, when people say America, they mean North America or the United States. Though Columbus made 4 voyages to the Americas, he never once landed on North American soil. Columbus first landed on a tiny island in the Bahamas called Guanahini by its residents, the Lucayan people. Columbus renamed the island San Salvador. On his third of 4 expeditions, Columbus set foot in present-day Venezuela, making him the first outsider since Leif Erikson to touch the mainland of the Americas. On his 4th voyage, Columbus landed in, among other places, present-day Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. You may be scoffing at my claim that Columbus never touched North American soil at this point, but many consider Central America to be separate from North America. However, if we say there is only mainland North and South America, and there's no such thing as Central America, Columbus still wasn't the first European to land in North America. I already gave this away, but Leif Erikson landed in present-day Newfoundland just under 500 years before Columbus. The details of this landing are sparse, but archaeological evidence proves there was a temporary settlement at the northern tip of Newfoundland. On the surface, it's extremely puzzling that Vikings never settled in Newfoundland, considering it has a better climate and far more resources than Greenland. In fact, the Vikings continued making trips to Newfoundland and the surrounding area to restock their Greenland settlements with timber, hides, and other goods for 300 years. Why not just stay in Newfoundland? One reason is Newfoundland is 1,000 miles from the Greenland settlements. Because the Viking settlements at Greenland were already strapped for resources, the trip to Newfoundland was extremely difficult. A permanent settlement requires resources for making tools. The Vikings would have to have either made these tools in Greenland to take them with them, or clear their Greenland settlement and take it all to Newfoundland. The later option meant the Vikings would be isolated in Newfoundland, as they would be destroying their refueling and resupplying station to Iceland, which was also their refueling and resupplying station from Iceland to Newfoundland. Another reason was the mild climate at the time. Greenland was still challenging, but the benefits of staying in Greenland, where they knew they could make a living, were too great to risk leaving for Newfoundland, or Vinland as they called it. Probably the most significant reason for not staying in Newfoundland was clashes with the native people. Lethal clashes are documented in two Viking sagas, Eric the Red's saga and Saga of the Greenlanders. Thorvald, Eric the Red's son and Leif's brother, was killed during the first expedition. Eric the Red himself never traveled to Newfoundland. Perhaps you've heard of the Kensington Runestone. This is an artifact that was found in Kensington, which is now Alexandria, Minnesota, in 1898. The runestone tells a very brief story of Viking settlers who, after returning from fishing, find 10 of their men dead. The date 1362 is carved into the runestone. It's fake. The most damning giveaway is the date. The problem is not the date itself, but how it is written. Nordic numbers are similar to Roman numerals, as in there's no such thing as a placeholder. You don't write 25 as IIV in Roman numerals. IIV would be the equivalent of 3, which is actually written III. 25 would actually be written as XXV, which basically means 10 plus 10 plus 5. Whoever carved the Kensington runestone made the same error. They used 4 symbols to write 1362, which is not how Nordic runes work. Even if the Vikings never landed in Newfoundland, and we say Central America is part of North America, Columbus still would not have been the first European to land there. John Cabot, an Italian-born British explorer, landed in Newfoundland in 1497. Like Columbus, Cabot thought he could reach Asia by sailing west. Cabot returned to England firmly believing he had landed in Asia. Columbus went to his grave believing he had done the same. Cabot returned with little of value, and upon his second expedition, he disappeared and was never heard from again.